Here is a myth. Some languages are easier to learn than others. Haven't we all read those articles saying that Chinese and Arabic are particularly difficult to learn and, well, you need a long time to learn them? But the question here is for who? Because if a speaker of Cantonese is learning Mandarin Chinese, it should be relatively straightforward, in the same way that for me, as a native speaker of German, learning English or Dutch or Swedish was relatively straightforward, because there were shortcuts, there were words that were similar, there were structures that are similar. So when there was a word I didn't know in Dutch, I could usually rely on German or any of the other Germanic languages I was already speaking to sort of guess what that word would be if somebody said it to me, or, I could get by in some way. So language, in a way, when you have a language family, that can help you learn the other languages of that language family. But it's not just history that plays a role here, but also language contact. Because through language contact, you can also have languages becoming much more similar in their grammars and in their vocabulary. An example is Somali. Somali is a Cushitic language, and for speakers of Somali, learning Arabic is relatively straightforward, even though Arabic is of a totally different language family. Arabic is a Semitic language. Why is that? Well, apart from shared cultural values, there is also a lot of Arabic in Somali. There are a lot of loanwords from Arabic in the Somali language. So, for a Somali speaker, then learning Arabic, there are shortcuts, there are words that they already know. And in the same way, in Southeast Asia, Chinese has had a lot of influence on the languages of the region. So, when a speaker of Vietnamese or Korean or Japanese is learning Chinese, there is this shared cultural value already, but also there will be a lot of vocabulary that's shared across the languages, which again will make it easier for those speakers to learn Chinese. Much easier than for somebody from Europe, somebody speaking English or German, learning Chinese, because there won't be any shared vocabulary or any shared structures. Okay, so your first language, the language you speak, will obviously influence whether or not learning another language is difficult, because the languages that are closer to your L1, to your first language, will be easier to learn. But then, of course, also your experience. So if you've learned other languages from a region, from a language family, from a certain contact pool, have you learned those languages? Well, then it may be easier for you to learn other languages of that type. But obviously it's not quite as straightforward, because there is my favorite example, Icelandic, which is a Germanic language, so is related to my native language. But Icelandic has a lot of irregularities and has a lot of what we call morphology. There are lots of inflections, there's lots of derivation going on, there's lots of stuff going on in Icelandic, and most of it is quite irregular. That obviously makes it much more challenging for me to learn than a language where most of that has disappeared, like Danish or Swedish. But Icelandic in itself is not necessarily more difficult to learn for somebody from the Faroe Islands, a language, Faroese, that is quite similar to Icelandic and that has similar complexity in its inflections, in its morphology. So it always depends on where you're from, what your first language is, whether or not another language is more difficult to learn. Right, but when you then learn a language, how long does it take you to learn? Obviously also depends on your environment, it depends on your learning methods, it depends on lots of different things. But I sometimes see those claims that our program teaches you a language in 3 months and you'll be able to speak it fluently. Those are always slightly dubious, because learning another language, even a closely related language, will take some time, it will take some immersion, it will take some effort, and it's not necessarily something that is really, really quick. But it's something that is incredibly exciting and something that is really a super skill to have. So learning another language is exciting in itself, but then being able to speak another language is even better. But it's not easy.